So anyway, hello, happy New Year to everybody. I have a question, Tom, which I've been meaning to ask for a while. I just kept forgetting, but it relates to something you said on a call a few weeks ago. And right at the end of the call, you said that you had never actually practiced self-inquiry. And then the call ended, and it was a bit of a cliffhanger. So, so I wanted to ask you about that, and I, I, I don't know if it's related, but you've also at another time you've mentioned that there was a time in your life when suddenly, um, almost out of the blue, I think you said it, you became incredibly devotional for Bhagwan and his teachings, and it just, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but what I remember, it was like something, it was like took you by surprise, it was like overwhelming and just like extraordinary. So, um, I would love you to share a little bit more about this, please.
Thank you, Piers. Thank you. You've outed me. You've outed me. No, I never did self-inquiry. What I mean, I may have tried to do self-inquiry and things like this. My primary path, I think, see, what I'm doing, I'm looking back retrospectively and trying to piece together what happened to me. You see, and that's never a perfect process. I might misremember things. Often as I'm talking to someone, I remember new things sometimes. It's all a bit murky and hazy, to be honest. Self-inquiry is the only way, right? So I did do self-inquiry, but I didn't um, frame it in that way. I didn't conceive or think of myself as doing self-inquiry. In retrospect, I can see I was doing self-inquiry. But if you asked me at the time, are you doing self-inquiry? I wouldn't know what you're talking about. I didn't really understand what self-inquiry was. A lot of this understanding I sort of pieced together later through reading some of Bhagwan's texts and things. Because I was very familiar with Vedanta teachings, but the way Bhagavan expresses his teachings, it took me a while to catch up with the way he expresses things. When I fell in love with him, I didn't really understand his teachings and the way he expresses himself. See, after liberation, after self-realization, I came across Sri Sadhu Om's teachings. And that helped, when I read them, I thought, this explains, this is what I felt. I didn't, and more, he actually explained concepts that I hadn't understood conceptually, you see. I think that's right, at least. I think that's right. So I, it, the way I would, from Tom's point of view, let's say that Tom's path was a path of bhakti, devotion, love. And in that path of bhakti, I used to think of Ramana as a person, I guess. No, not a person. Kind of a person and a presence. Maybe like how many sorts of more intuitive or mystical religious people think of God. But he was a person, he was a figure. I just felt so much love. What it is, I felt so much love for him, and I also felt him in my life. I felt his presence in my life. Does that make sense? And I found myself, it didn't surprise me. The mind did have thoughts of like what's going on here, but it felt very natural, but it was very overwhelming, meaning Not overwhelming in a negative way. Like if something overwhelms you, you might feel emotionally overwhelmed. No, it was overwhelming in that it was, it felt very nice. It felt like I was compelled to do something, but not against my will. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes.
There's probably better words to use than what I'm using, but I felt compelled to devote myself to Bhagawan, but not compelled against my will. I just felt an overwhelming urge or desire. I felt a huge amount of desire. It was love. It was love. I felt a huge amount of love towards him. I didn't conceive of him as myself. But as that love changed and matured and grew, he revealed to me that he is me. And then this love which was going outwards towards him, went, it's like attention in a way. And love going outwards towards this presence in my life. And I was visualizing him and thinking of him. I didn't really sort of look at photos of him and stuff like that, but I liked to imagine him inside in my mind's eye. And I felt his presence kind of around me and within me. But that attention or that love slowly kind of went towards myself because I realized he was here. And I've been reading his teachings where he says, I am, in certain works, I think I used to really like, and I still do, I used to really like Upadesha Saram. It's such a beautiful, complete text, 30 verses long. And in the first few verses, he explains that what he really is within. So my love was for him, and but then he revealed himself as being within me. So my attention went towards myself. Now, later on, reading Sri Sadhguru, I realized that is self-attention. That's self-inquiry, isn't it? But I didn't think of it in those terms at the time. I didn't know the teachings about self-attention. I don't think I'd heard the phrase self-attention, which is very much, I believe, Sri Sadhguru style of phrasing, self-attention. So for me, I just fell in love with Bhagavan and dissolved into him or became one with him. This is the way it felt to me. So all that's left is him.
It sounds like it was a spontaneous, natural flow.
Yeah,
Um, like
exactly. That's
not
it.
even not even an urge, just a natural.
There was like a spontaneous, I use the word overwhelming to mean that it was, it was, there was a great, it just, I felt compelled, but again, not against my will. I just really, really wanted to. I don't know how can I phrase it? I don't know. Maybe someone can come up with some better wording.
Was there any point on this phase of your life, Tom, when I don't know, when there was a pivotal moment perhaps where you just felt like whatever you had left, like whatever was residual resistance, you, I don't know, consciously or unconsciously decided to surrender all of that as well, just
Yeah.
completely.
Yeah, I think so because I'd been seeking for a long time. You know, it's not like this happened to me out of the blue. I was a spiritual seeker for a long time, you know, sort of 10, 15 years, this kind of length of time. And I think I was getting like sick of all this seeking and nothing was working. I mean, things worked, but not really. And when I came across Bhagawan, the time, you know the story that when I first came across him and his teachings, I rejected them. I just wasn't attracted to him at all, or that what he was saying. It just seemed silly to me. But a couple of years later, I think I was probably desperate enough. I don't know, desperate's not quite the right word, but I, I, I think I was open to him because other things that made more sense to me hadn't worked. I was much more interested in the Buddhist style teachings, the intellectual teachings that made much more sense to me intellectually. The more Savikalpa style teachings, Savikalpa meaning with objects present, the ones that say objects and the consciousness are one, these made much more sense to me. But then you realize they don't work. They don't give you the liberation. I was listening to all these teachers, following all these teachings, and they weren't giving me what I needed because I felt like I understood what they were saying. Yes, like if you have a teaching that says there is all what you are is consciousness, and everything that appears, such as the body, the mind, various objects of the world, appear in consciousness as consciousness. Well, I got all that. I kind of understood that, and everything within consciousness is happening spontaneously without a doer. Kind of understood that, and I used to read like Tibetan texts and Sanskrit texts and Pali texts. Sometimes I'd try and read them in their original language, and sometimes you would battle through volumes of books. And then at the end, it's just this little, very simple teaching. And you think to yourself, why have I just spent like, 2 months trying to figure out this text? And why have they made it sound so difficult? And it's such a simple teaching. And I found the whole thing very frustrating and non-liberating. And then there were questions I had, like, how do we know there's only one consciousness? How do I know that you don't have a consciousness and I don't have a consciousness? And then how do we know it's one consciousness? And then people used to say things like, well, you have a consciousness, I have a consciousness, they're the same. I'm like, well, how do you know it's the same? And how do you know consciousness isn't to do with the body? How do you know that when the body dies, the consciousness continues? All these sorts of questions. And I couldn't find the answers that satisfied me. So I was at a point where I was becoming disillusioned, I think, with lots of other teachings. And I think that energetically opened me because Tom's mind's sort of, he can be quite relentless in pursuing an answer. If something doesn't make sense to Tom, it doesn't make sense, and he wants to know what's the answer. There are many teachers who claim to say they knew the answers. It felt like to Tom, they didn't know the answers, or if they did, they weren't explaining it properly in a way he could understand. And then I came across Pokemon the second time, and then I feel like he entered into my life and took me over. I feel like he took me over. This is what I mean by compel, or there's like a sense of force, but it wasn't against my will. I was happy. He took me. It doesn't make sense.
It sounds to me like as though at some point you gave up mentally trying to understand the answers. Would that be fair to say?
I no, I don't think so. I don't think so. I don't think I still was trying to find the answers, but I was open to something else on some level, I believe. Is this helpful to hear this stuff though? Is it helpful? I don't know.
It is.
I don't want to talk about myself too much. That's sort of, but I'm happy to if it's helpful to you.
It's it's beautiful. I just um
Okay, some of you are finding it helpful. I'm happy to continue then.
there's almost something which, well, you always say it, I mean, cannot even be put into words. It's just something to do with this, for me anyway, this devotional aspect that arose within you and became all consuming, just stronger and stronger. And
Yeah. You know what? As you're speaking, see, I've mentioned this before, but I was very against an idea of a guru or a teacher or a teacher you devote yourself to. This was not something I liked. Tom does not like that. Conceptually, Tom never liked that idea of devotion to a guru, to a teacher. So this was something that I resisted. My mind had resisted. And not only has it resisted it, it never felt the desire. You know, the last thing that Tom wanted was to fall in love with a teacher. Or this is not what he was looking for. He was looking for liberation, enlightenment. He wanted to be like the Buddha and like go under the Bodhi tree or something and figure this out by himself and not have to rely on some sort of, woo-woo teacher type thing, you see. So intellectually there's a lot of resistance to this kind of path. But I guess but then when Bhagavan came into my heart, into my life, it just felt so right. And I couldn't help and I wanted to just go with him. It's like a benevolent father figure coming into your life and saying, "Hey, come with me. I'll come with me. I'll protect you. I'll keep you safe." And then me just sort of saying, "Oh yes, yes, I want to go with you." And it was just total trust and love, and I didn't know where it would end up, and I didn't really care that much, and I didn't feel in danger at all. It just felt very safe and very natural and very wonderful. And yes, retrospect, I did self-inquiry, but I didn't call it self-inquiry. I didn't know I was doing self-inquiry. I didn't understand that self-inquiry meant self-attention because I'd read plenty of Ramana stuff, but I don't think I might have come across Sri Sadhuam at that point, but I don't think I'd really registered the value of self-attention.
I relate to your experience to a lesser extent. Um, Something similar happened with me, but then I get my ego just took me away from that. Um, but now I feel much more drawn to this devotional practice and surrender. It's beautiful to hear. Thank you.
So I'll just add a couple of things, which is that the way I was educated and brought up, you see, was essentially in a sort of, I guess, what would you call it, like an enlightenment paradigm, meaning enlightenment of the European Enlightenment, secular, the power of reason and thought and science and scientific progress and discovery. This was the kind of intellectual world that Tom occupied and operated in. But he was also interested in spirituality, but with that kind of paradigm. So that gave me much more affinity with these Buddhist style expositions to teachings, which seem very scientific and in accordance with physics and particle physics and things like this. So the last thing I wanted was just to fall in love with a person, um, or an entity or whatever, a presence. And faith was something I really didn't like the idea of. Didn't like the idea of belief or faith. But of course, this is a part of faith. That's one way of framing it. For me, this is a path of faith. We feel something within us, whatever it is, and we open ourselves up to that inner knowing. And that is faith, that inner knowing and being willing to receive from ourselves or from Bhagavan or from however you might not believe in Ramana or Ramana might not be your guru. Whatever you have that feeling for, open yourself up to that It's an intuitive path. And that intuition and faith is the same thing ultimately. Um, it's also a scientific path because it's all it's all experientially verifiable. And it's not ultimately based on conceptual belief or creed or dogma. That is all secondary. So I've just remembered that in response to Piers's question and in response to the conversation I've just had with Julius. When I when I was falling in love, feeling immense devotion to Bhagwan, I was not interested in liberation. I was not interested in self-realization. I couldn't care less about that. I just wanted to be with Bhagwan. Now, I'm not saying this should be how it is for you. You have to follow your own path. You shouldn't try and imitate someone else. You have to be true to yourself. I'm just sharing for you how it was for me, as far as I recall it. Again, my memory may not be perfect. So I just wanted to be with Bhagawan. I wanted to be with him. It was just so blissful and wonderful to be with him. That's one thing. I wasn't looking for liberation. I wasn't trying to remove the world or remove the ego. Now, I've sensed that with self-inquiry, it's like this as well. We just want to know what we are. We want to love ourselves. The bliss of being, just the bliss of being. There's something in us that recognizes this is where happiness is found. We want to be happy. We want to be at peace, don't we? It's the bliss of being yourself. You're not trying to attain realization, liberation. You're just so happy just to be yourself and not to go outwards towards all the objects, which you discover movement towards objects is suffering. It might not feel like suffering or look like suffering to someone else, but you start to realize movement is suffering and being is bliss. So then we're not trying to discover who we are, even. We're just the joy and the love of being what we are, being ourselves, coming back to home. That's one thing. Oh, yes. The other thing is there was a point. See, I used to visualize Bhagwan's form. Maybe, imagine him sitting in a certain way or imagine his face. And then I used to feel his presence. And sometimes I wouldn't imagine him, but there was this sense of him, Ramana, Ramana Maharshi. There's a sense that I was devoting myself to him. There got to a point in my devotion where all the images fell away. I felt so in love with him, his form. There got to a point where it all fell away. I started to feel quite scared at this point. Not scared. I started to worry. I thought, oh no, what's happening? I've lo I've lost my attachment to Bhagwan. Before I was in love with him, and then all the form falls away. See, I was going to the Nirvikalpa aspect, you see? I didn't understand that you need to go to the Nirvikalpa aspect properly at that point. I'd read those teachings, but I dismissed those teachings. I'd read the teachings about Nirvikalpa Samadhi. I was very familiar with them, but I dismissed those teachings as being stupid and ridiculous. And the teachings I liked, even at this time, were those Buddhist style teachings or the Sarvikalpa teachings that say objects and consciousness are one. They were the teachings I liked, the mind liked. So in this devotional process, um, there came a point where all the name form went away, and I started to get worried. Oh, what's happening now? I seem to be letting go of Bhagavan. You see, when this devotion carries on, it goes to silence and stillness. And I felt guilty. I thought, am I doing something wrong here? Because before I was so devoted to Bhagavan, and now I'm just being still, actually. It just left me in silence. And then I started to worry. I tried to come out of the silence and go back to the form of Bhagavan because that's what I liked. That's what I knew. And then I read somewhere, I think it might have been again, this could be wrong, but I think it was in Sri Guru Ramana Prasadam, which is a text written by Muruganar. I don't think I had the text, but I think I came across a verse, which was, this might be wrong, but essentially, wherever I came across it, the teaching was um, that the highest form of bhakti, devotion, is silence. The highest form of bhakti, parabhakti, which means the supreme bhakti, parabhakti was silence. And this helped me allow that process that was naturally unfolding in me if I hadn't stopped it because of my mind. My mind had an idea, a concept that was obstructing. This is a very familiar theme, by the way. This is what I do with you guys. A lot of what I do is sometimes just take away the concepts and allow you just to go on your own path. It allowed me to have faith that the process that was taking me to this nirvikalpa state where no objects are there, the forms are gone, was still devotion to Bhagavan. And so I stopped feeling worried and guilty that I had left him. And that allowed me to be still in his. It wasn't quick though. I think it took like, I don't know, a few weeks or months even before I could allow myself to go silent without feeling worried or guilty that I was leaving Bhagavan behind. The mind, you see, the mind is gets in the way. The mind also helped me because I read that verse or teaching somewhere that said the highest form of devotion is silence. And then together with it, probably like in a text like Upadesha Saram, which says, you know, well, I can't remember exactly what it says, but essentially says that the formless consciousness is God. I also didn't see Bhagavan as God when I first started devoting my. I saw him as I guess, I don't know really what I saw. I didn't really conceive of him as anything. I just fell in love with him, but I kind of saw him as an entity or as a person. But eventually, all when I it sounds grandiose, but when I became one with him, when it wasn't that I became one with him, when all that was left was him, that's a better way of saying it. When all that was left was him, then I realized he was God. I never thought of him as God. I just thought of him as this presence, this person that I was supremely in love with and whom I trusted. I trust, there's this sense of trust, immense trust in him. I didn't like his verbal teachings that much, but I didn't care about that. I still liked my other style teachings, Buddhist style type teachings or Sarvakalpa teachings. But it allowed me to go into silence and trust that I was still devoted to him. So really, my path is a path of a devotee. But I was the sort of never wanted to be a devotee, but what always interests me, not what always interests, but I found it interesting that my mind, once I'd started, the mind didn't protest, you know? I remember the mind thinking, what are you doing, Tom? What are you doing devoting yourself to this person? Isn't it silly? But I knew it was fine. Something. And maybe because I tried all these other things, they weren't working. Part of my mind was like, whatever, got nothing to lose. Maybe that was a part of it too. So that's another thing. First thing, I wasn't looking. So the first point I said was I wasn't really looking for liberation. Just wanted to be with Bhagavan. Second thing is that there comes a point in the practice where all the names and forms disappear. This is nirvikalpa. This is where you become silent still. And don't be afraid of this. This is just natural. Third thing, I guess, is that this is necessary for liberation. Unless you go nirvikalpa, there is no liberation. It stays on the level of the mind. The people who teach Sarvikalpa teachings only, they're not very good, but they're good. The reason they're not very good is if they're taught in the wrong context, they're misleading. They're very good if you understand the context that I'm sharing with you, in that they're a means towards nirvikalpa. Then it's very good. Then all teachings are good. But if you're taught that Sarvikalpa is the end, it's just non-liberating. And that you'll see it stays on the mental level. And you get the talking shops, you get the intellectual talking shops. So it has to go nirvikalpa at the end. This is why silence is necessary. Silence means nirvikalpa, means no objects, no movement, no maya, no ignorance. If you don't go nirvikalpa, then ignorance remains. Nirvikalpa is also known as ajata. Ajata, no creation, no birth. If you don't go ajata, that truth of that is not genuinely seen, then ignorance remains. So jhata has to be realized in your direct experience. Of course, there is no direct experience in a jhata. There's no creation, there's no objective phenomena. It's just the truth. That's the highest truth. But that is the liberating factor. That is the self. That is what you are. A jhata is the highest truth. If the highest truth is not discovered, then ignorance still remains. And you will not, suffering will continue on some level, and you will not be satisfied. There'll be dissatisfaction, dukkha in Buddhism. Dukkha means pain or unsatisfactoriness, hurt, suffering. Yeah. Ulysses, it was written, for some reason, the necessity of nirvikalpa ajata is emphasized very rarely in more common contemporary teachings. Well, that's my experience. And this is why most of these contemporary teachings that don't emphasize the need for nirvikalpa are non-liberating and lead to clarity in many cases, but ultimately they don't, it leads to confusion because eventually it doesn't liberate. And then the seekers are, well, I get what you're saying, but why isn't this happening? And then there's a disconnect. Traditionally, all the scriptures of Vedanta Buddhism, all the good ones at least, they're not the later ones that sometimes are written by intellectuals, but they all explain the need for nirvikalpa. And as you say, Julius, in the recommended reading list, I've emphasized, well, I've chosen those texts. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Very grateful to you all for being here with me. I'm very grateful for Bhagwan giving us this opportunity to come together, for giving me the tools I need to hopefully share this. Thank you so much, everyone. My love to you all. Keep Bhagwan in your hearts. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.